research and innovation assets in the area of ICT for health and aging well domains. I hope that over the next 35 minutes or so, you'll find that the work we've been doing resonates with some of the challenges that you may be encountering in coordinating the communication and dissemination and exploitation activities in your project, and that you can learn enough to be able to explore applying these tools to your own projects. I think communications and dissemination activities for any venture, whether they are mature enterprises or dynamic startups, are about two things. First of all, attraction, drawing customers, buyers, partners, stakeholders towards your business and your products and your services, and making it easy for them to build a relationship with you. And competition, establishing your market or service patch and ensuring that people know the risks of not doing business with you and that you are the best and most committed to success. I think within the AEL research and innovation projects domain, because consortia are new and your offerings are still experimental and developmental, there are two other important communications goals: to surprise, to generate interest and inquisitive activity in both your journey and your achievements, and to nurture, to promote and to protect the development of your project at an embryonic and vulnerable stage in its development. And these four strands will animate the research and innovation activity and are interwoven into all aspects of this morning's discussion. I'd also like to highlight that this morning's webinar is one of two in the series. This morning we're going to look at the reference framework tool and how it can be used to organize and coordinate the range of content, information and models that underpin communications, dissemination and exploitation activities. In the second webinar on the 3rd of July, my colleague Carmen Canos will explore the tools that are needed to develop more detailed dissemination strategies and action plans, and to support the management and implementation of specific communication and dissemination activities. Together we think that they will offer a comprehensive approach to getting the right messages to the right people at the right time and in the right manner. We have four primary objectives to cover in this webinar. Firstly, to learn from ongoing and recently completed projects across the ICT for health and active and aging well world about many of the communication, dissemination, exploitation and sustainability challenges. Secondly, to understand how a systematic, holistic and continuous improvement approach to communications and dissemination can enhance project development pathways and strengthen project outcomes. Thirdly, to learn how a reference framework tool developed by Hyvisio can help model the developing assets and results across your projects into an integrated information platform as a basis for communication and dissemination actions. And then finally, to gain insights into how to apply the Hyvisio reference framework tool in communication work packages through some extracts of a worked example in an AEL project. As a result, we hope that the webinar can help to enhance the compliance of your communication and dissemination work package activities to meet AEL project objectives. And when I finish this morning, to provide you with an opportunity to interact directly with the Hyvisio team through 20 minutes or so of questions and answers after the webinar, and also to arrange one-on-one follow-ups if desired. We've organized the webinar into 4 blocks to address these objectives: examining some of the key communication challenges, discussing important factors for success, exploring the reference framework and how it works, and then examining how to apply the framework in practice. So let's start by looking at some of the challenges. We've reviewed the inputs and contributions of 25 projects to date, and here we list the main challenges facing the project that we've engaged with. Without going through them all, some of the themes are asset integrity. There is a tendency for integrated, platform-oriented project assets to separate into their constituent elements when considering future exploitation. And in relation to exploitation integrity, there are few instances where a consortium will stay together for future joint exploitation, However, there is a strong tendency for consortia to dissolve or new groupings or consortia to form when progressing to future stages, and sometimes this involves a disaggregation of intellectual property. Commercial expertise. There are many situations where there are gaps in the consortia's composition in relation to downstream business modelling and commercialisation planning. In relation to acceptance and acceptability, for many projects involving home-based sensor applications, there are concerns about how to address consumer and market acceptability in relation to privacy and ethical issues. In relation to the funding continuum, with the trends towards a greater emphasis on project impact, exploitation of results and innovation diffusion, there is a greater need for project and consortia to look to complementary sources of funding on the pathway to commercialization. And in some project assets, the exploitation potential is less about technology innovation, but more about the need for social enterprise and social innovation. However, common to all is how to better organize the information and models underneath these issues so that we can communicate, disseminate, and exploit effectively. These themes have been synthesized into the following synergy exploration model. The core axis to this model is the pathway from solution modeling, that is the research and innovation project, towards business modeling, i.e. the commercial engagement in the market. And two key components are the energy in the project and the project team providing a push force, and the attractiveness in the marketplace providing a pull force. The transitional readiness between these two poles of activity is characterized by whether the project and its assets need more research and innovation, or the extent to which they are implementable as the basis for exploitation. And there is a range of factors and mechanisms of transition that may act as barriers or friction to a smooth path towards implementation. These include the following: market complexity and fragmentation, the tendency to split assets on project completion, capacity skills mix for business and market orientation, leadership and team structure, bringing forward the proposition, splitting up the consortium and the loss of coherence at the end of a project, and user design orientation in relation to consumer empowerment and/or service effectiveness. Impacting and informing how the project consortia approach these challenges to exploitation, or how they approach the challenge of fostering greater acceptance and solutions know-how, and how they view the widening of the funding landscape for innovation. There is a growing range of additional resource and funding options for projects on the pathway from research to commercial implementation. Along with more traditional research and innovation funding from national, EU and international organizational sources, there is growing traction to gain greater leverage from other more risk implementation oriented funding such as venture capital, the European Structural and Regional Development Funds and pre-commercialization instruments. And among the main challenges for strengthening acceptance of AAL solutions and platform application product and service design responses that must address greater trust, privacy and ethical considerations. How these forces are externally and globally encoded in legislation, regulation, standards, data protection and security guidelines, and also technical interoperability, also pose additional factors influencing market acceptance. This research to implementation transition readiness model points to an array of communication actions shown in the diagram. These are directed to the research and development community for additional research consolidation, further development, or deeper trials. The funding community for either further R&D funding, solution take-up at local, regional and national levels, or business investment for working capital. The public policy community to influence factors that could reduce barriers or accelerate greater acceptance. And most importantly for AAL projects, to the market and end user community to form direct or indirect value chain engagement with local and regional public service buyers, intermediaries, industry and direct to the customer. And these communities of interest represent the critical array of stakeholders in our AAL project success. Although strictly speaking, EU research and innovation programs such as AAL have a fixed duration with contract start and end points. In reality, partners bring their previous histories and internal strategies to the projects. More importantly for partners, the project collectively, and funding stakeholders, they bring aspirations for the project's future or futures. Project information and its dissemination and communication is evolving along this communication or continuum or pathway, and we need to be clear about how it is organized and presented. And there are two primary areas to consider. Galvanizing the present, that is sustaining and energizing the team's activities, maintaining stakeholder enthusiasm, to some extent polishing the diamond, and also promoting and fostering its futures. Shifting from traditional project approaches with fixed start and end ideas to more bounded research and innovation activity along a pathway to sustainability, impact and growth. I'd now like to discuss some of the key factors for success, and it's centered on developing a project information base that needs to be systematic, to be iterative, and to be integrative. We've identified and highlighted 6 C's that need to be recognized and which point to the need for a systematic approach underpinned by a strong information base. First of all, recognizing the complexity and that we're dealing in complex emerging markets with diverse audiences. Secondly, that we need to build confidence for investors and other funders in our ecosystem. Thirdly, that we are dealing with collaborative project development environments, and this brings both opportunities and responsibilities to work effectively together. There is a need to manage the continuity in our messages pre, during and post-project. There is a need to look at our project as a coherent whole and as an organic development, incrementally moving forward over the course of the project and beyond. And I think finally about being specific and centered, but keeping directions and options open to be responsive to emerging market developments. Our approach to the project information base needs to be iterative and responsive to dynamic changes over the course of a project development. And the growth of the project information base to support the project's communication should be cyclical and incremental in line with the project's evolution. The PDSA, or the Plan, Do, Study, Act model of the Institute for Health Innovation, is a helpful learning loop to apply within project cycles. Taking a systems perspective, projects have a structure, a behavior, and an ecology or ecosystem interacting over a timeline. And the extent to which these can be kept in some form of dynamic equilibrium will provide the information base with the vitality needed to support communication and dissemination actions. Finally, we need to be integrative, recognizing that the hustle and bustle of AAL project operating environments can make it difficult to achieve this with quality. Across all the dimensions of communication, dissemination and exploitation and sustainability, we're looking to an information base that can be coherent and consistent, it can be targeted and tailored, it can be efficient and effective, and it can be creative and differentiating. And in doing this, we need to recognize that we're drawing together information and models that are addressing challenges such as business modeling, the pilot sites and the geographies of our test cases, user engagement, and technical developments. This is calling out for a concurrent and dynamic single source of project content to support communications and dissemination actions that is organized in a systematic way. And it is to this challenge that we've developed the reference framework as a mechanism to draw these elements together. So I'd now like to explore the dimensions of the reference framework in some more detail. At its simplest, the reference framework is a two-dimensional matrix represented by 6 rows and 6 columns. The rows can be considered as different perspectives or different stakeholders, different scopes, or different levels of detail. And the columns address different interrogatives or questions in relation to the model, their representations, and they indicate the primary elements of communication for the project both internally and externally. It is useful to look at the reference framework as a systematic set of questions or answers and statements about all dimensions of the project, an information index on a project's tangible and intangible assets, artifacts, resources, models, processes, and results, a structured information base for internal and external communication, dissemination, and exploitation, a collaborative enterprise checklist for all AEL coherence, consistency, and completeness, and then finally as a dynamic repository index of a project's intellectual property asset evolution over and beyond the lifetime of the project. The columns address the different interrogatives or questions in relation to model representations and indicate the primary elements of communication of the project both internally and externally. Each cell, or the intersection between a row and a column, represents a unique aspect of the project. And as the project develops, it generates artifacts, results, know-how, deliverables, and assets that fill out the framework. If we look at a couple of columns, for example, the Who column, at the highest level of market context, it's looking at the target markets and the market segments that we want to address. At the next level, or the level of the business concept, it's looking to potential partners and customers. At the level of solution design, it's looking at active participants and users of our products. At the technology platform level, it's looking to those developed in the development, maintenance, and support of our projects. At the devices and services level, it's looking to component and third-party service providers. And finally, at the lowest level of the data and the schema, it's looking to the human interactive experience of end users with their data. Other columns are more asset and massive oriented and results oriented, such as the What column, or more performance oriented, such as the Why column. And as we answer the questions and insert the models, we can start to examine the coherence and the consistency of the project. If the columns are their interrogatives, then the rows can be considered as different perspectives, different stakeholders, different scopes, or different levels of detail. For example, the highest level row identifies the area or domain that the project is addressing. It's the view of the stakeholders or investors, and its scope is that of its operating ecosystem, the level of market strategy. At the second layer, the focus is more on the business concept, and here the interrogatives and the questions align directly with areas within the business modeling canvases. If we go down to the lowest, or the data schema layer, we can see the lower levels of technical details, data types and sources, algorithms, data storage and security strategies, human interaction, and auto events and auto scheduling, all contributing to overall information quality, which will be underpinning acceptance, reliability and scalability, and performance effectiveness, ultimately delivering the value proposition and contributing to overall impact. As mentioned throughout this presentation, projects aren't standing in a vacuum and are not standing still. And the information models within the framework will continue to evolve as the project develops. There are likely to be two strands to this evolution. Technical developments, as your product or elements of your product increase their readiness levels through the stages of the transition readiness level models, and also business development, as the project understands more about customer needs and starts delivering value. Here the pilots represent a wonderful opportunity to transition from testers to demonstrators and on to early mover customers. There may be several milestone stages where a full snapshot of the reference model aligns with an organizational development state transition, such as product completion or a startup phase or at a particular stage of an enterprise model development. The reference framework tool therefore sits in a very important place between many of the AAL project development activities and vital communication actions. If we look at the current typical aspects of an AAL project, there is often little opportunity to harmonize or to align the different strands as they feed into the communication actions. It is here that we see the reference framework acting as a coordinating tool to assure cohesion and coherence for downstream communication activities. It can also provide vital information for more specific negotiations and inform targeted stakeholder and customer engagements. Finally, for our fourth part, I'd like to present you with some ideas about how to use the framework in practice. Collaboration work isn't easy, but a key outcome is to build a consistent consortium consensus. And critical here is to achieve common, shared and agreed approaches, to ensure that partner-specific approaches reinforce and align with collective views, and to keep it concurrent with other strands, particularly the evolution of business modeling. We found that a primary working method for developing the reference framework is in interactive workshops with project partners as a significant agenda item at regular project consortium meetings or project steering group meetings. Preparation and pre-work done can be done by the dissemination work package leader and other partners involved in that package. Post-session work involves the capture, distribution and updating the documents and resources. And throughout this process, continuous contributions can be brought in from other activities during the project. At the steering group meetings, the discussions can be aided by the following support tools. And we've developed a reference framework chart and also an overview PowerPoint presentation, which is downloadable from the Hivisio website at the downloads page. And if you scroll down to the training course materials, they will be able to be downloaded and you can print out the charts to support your activities. There are other enterprise architecture and business process management tools available commercially related to this space, but they can be expensive and are sometimes a sledgehammer to crack a nut. These images capture the dynamic of an interactive reference framework development session at an AAL project steering group meeting. The PowerPoint is being used to highlight the particular areas that are needed to be explored at the session so that everybody can see the relationship to other aspects of the development. These types of sessions can be very interactive and drive both deeper considerations and cross-partner discussions. The wall chart can then capture ideas that are generated by the participants, and they can be discussed and debated at these sessions. Agreement isn't essential initially at the early stages of projects, as several scenarios for development can be kept open for further discussion. This is a detail of a wall chart. You can see the two sheets of A1 put side by side. In this example, the desire was to keep the conversation focused on the market and business layers in our initial discussions. However, asset resources and solution design and also the application and device layer considerations were constantly being introduced. This reflects both the issues and concerns of the partners and also the natural interrelationships and dependencies between the layers in the cells. Here we see an initial early iteration of the cells when exploring the characteristics of the project from a spatial or where perspective. Characteristics for consideration here are location, places and adjacency, networks, distribution, and mobility. In this example, you can see how considerations of where vary from high-level discussions around market geographies and territories. Here, the group wanted to initially look at addressing regions covered by the pilot partners and then wider national coverage in these territories, and finally looking to territory intersections where languages may overlap and areas where there may be lower barriers to entry through lower competition. This then moves down through localization and intermediary supports for business models, where they wanted to explore taking on a B2B to customer business model, through to configurability for third-party branding, and then finally down to spatial indexing to support location-aware services that would trigger also cross-boundary conditions. These will get fleshed out as the project develops, but provide a first set of consistent project information to communicate to different stakeholder interests in a coherent manner. It is at this stage that the reference framework information feeds into supporting the specific dissemination and communication action plans for the project. These areas will be covered in detail in the second webinar on the 3rd of July, hosted by Carmen Quinos, but you can see the general shape of how the information base fits into the messages and information to be disseminated, particularly the tangible and intangible results, assets and artifacts, the target audiences and stakeholders and their locations and territories, the key activities for dissemination, the channels, networks and events, the planning and scheduling of these activities both during and after the core project period, and finally pointers to how to measure success, generally in terms of both quantitative and qualitative performance effectiveness and measures. I'd like to finish by leaving you with some tips and techniques in relation to how to apply the framework to your project. At a structural level, it's well worth starting by mapping the initial project proposal and the project's goals and aspirations into the reference framework. This can act as an initial baseline from which the development can be tracked. But don't be alarmed if there is significant change during the course of the project. The market is changing also. At a behavioral level, it is then wise to do an iteration at each subsequent consortium or project steering group meeting to keep it up to date and to ensure that it is responding to incremental developments in all project dimensions. Outside of the meetings, those responsible for the dissemination, and other partners too, should tune into the ecosystem and get into a listen and watch mode in relation to what's happening in the marketplace. AAL projects are operating much closer to the market, and it's important that projects don't get passed by competitive developments or significant market or policy shifts. Following media streams and keeping scrapbooks of related news and policy developments in media in all targeted territories is important. This can inform your narratives about solutions, delivery models and market impacts. And finally, be evaluative and adopt a continuous improvement approach. Always ask, how can we do it better, and how will we know that we're doing it better? These will be important indicators for success going forward. A final insight. For many projects in the ICT for health and aging well fields, many projects adopt twin marketing strategies, where there is a business-to-business proposition to the public sectors and to service providers on the one hand, and also a business-to-consumer proposition on the other hand. It is important to recognize that the value propositions and the messages that you direct to these different stakeholder groups needs to be strongly differentiated. Consumer comforts and convenience are not always a prerequisite requirement for effective public resource management. We need to understand the languages that the different stakeholders need to understand, need to address. AAL projects are about innovating, they're about improving, they're about implementing, impacting, and investing. If you harness the information base in your project in a way that can stitch these dimensions together into a compelling narrative, you'll have the information and content and messages that you need to feed into your dissemination and communication planning and strategies going forward. And Carmen will discuss how best to do this on Friday's webinar. Finally, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention over the course of this presentation, and I'd like to hand you back to Danielle and Borja, who can moderate any questions and comments that you'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you very much for this presentation. Now we can take questions for Rod. So if you have questions, type them in the chat window or raise your hand and to be able to discuss better, maybe if you have a microphone. That's also a very good idea. So any questions?
Indeed, there is a small, as you see, there is on the top of the page, there is a small logo, little man raising the hand. So that's the button you need to push in case you need to, you would like to take the floor. But if you are shy, you can write the questions in the chat also.
Yeah.
And Rod, if one wants more sort of support in project communications, how does one go about?
Well, the first thing I think is to go to the Hyvisio website and look at some of the training materials there, and also download the charts. But if any of the organizations would like a one-to-one follow-up, maybe if they could answer to your email address or to the project's email address, and we can schedule in a 15 or 20-minute conversation sometime over the next 2 to 3 weeks.
That's wonderful.
I know it can be challenging. Different projects are at different stages of development, so some of these points may resonate to different people in different ways. So in some instances, it's easier to address this on a one-to-one basis rather than broadcast inquiries. But so we can certainly do it on a one-to-one basis.
Okay, that's very good news for everyone attending this seminar or webinar.
And if I could just highlight that Carmen is doing the follow-up webinar on Friday, and Carmen her tools will go into great detail around how to do this specific dissemination and communication strategies and plans that would be informed by the kind of information that would be gathered and harvested through using the reference framework.
Thank you for that, Rod. And so we'll thank you for your presentation, and then we.
So yeah, I don't know if before ending we can maybe ask again participants if you have any questions. It's the moment. So yeah, well.
Okay.
Well, if not, we thank you for having participated, and see you on Friday at 10 o'clock. Then Carmen Xenos will present.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rod.
Thank you, Daniel and Borja, for hosting that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.